Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fountain House's Defining Social Practice webinar. As you will notice, all participants have been muted. If you have a question to ask to our presenters, please send your question into the Q&A panel located in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and your questions will be answered after the presentation. If you have any technical issues, please send a private chat to the host, the directions of which you can find in the chat window. Thank you for joining. Please welcome Elliott Madison and Mark Joseph of Fountain House.
Good afternoon. I'm Elliott Madison. I am the program director at Fountain House, and this afternoon I am joined by Mark Joseph, who is a member and working as a peer counselor. And today we're really excited to talk to you and give you an introduction about social practice. The reason we're very excited is because, as far as we know, this is the first time that a kind of introduction and training about social practice has been available to those outside the kind of Fountain House model. And we believe it has great promise to solve a variety of problems that have been fairly intractable. So social practice is something that Fountain House has been implementing and innovating for over 70 years. We have created 300 model programs in 30 different countries, and we serve about 100,000 people worldwide in social practice. So today we're very excited to share what we know about social practice and the promises of social practice and what it can do. So let's get right into it. So social practice is a type of therapeutic intervention that utilizes the community as its main mode of doing the therapeutic work. The therapeutic work is traditionally with seriously mentally ill, people who have had a serious mental illness crisis, and specifically social practice is about mitigating or alleviating the social or sometimes called negative symptoms that individuals experience during or after having severe mental illness. So that is what we're going to be talking about today in some depth. By serious mental illness, we mean an illness that has had a profound functional impairment in people's lives. It has really knocked them off track. It's a serious crisis. It affects about 1 in 4 people over the course of time. For Fountain House, we work with people that have schizophrenic diagnosis, schizoaffective, bipolar, and major depression. We believe that social practice is particularly well suited to work with people with serious mental illness because of the social damage that is done due to the illness, which we'll get into in just a moment. So social practice is a therapeutic intervention that looks at the social symptoms, or sometimes called the negative symptoms. These are the symptoms that correlate from the primary diagnosis. So, for example, if I am hearing voices and having delusions, those are indicators that I may have, for example, schizophrenia, right? But the fact that I have the social isolation, I might be isolating, I might be anxious, I might be homeless, I might have an addiction. These are the secondary or the corollary symptoms of the fact that I had or have schizophrenia. So that is what we mean by the social symptoms. What's interesting to know and why social practice is so interesting and important is that what we've learned over the past 20 years is that while psychotherapeutic and specifically psychopharmacological interventions have done a lot in alleviating the primary or positive symptoms of a variety of mental illnesses, including severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar, the social symptoms have not been moved very much. Unemployment rates for people with SMI are still the same as they were 50 years ago, pretty much. The quality of life measures are about the same. Homelessness, if anything, seems to have increased. So while we've done as a society and as people interested in mental health, what we've done well in removing the very detrimental positive or indicating symptoms of mental illness, we have not been successful at the social or negative symptoms. And that's where social practice really comes on its own. I like to use the metaphor that if I were in a car crash, in a car accident, and I go to the hospital, they would work on the positive symptoms first. They may replace my knee if it was fractured. They may have to do some surgery around my tendons. But after that, I would still need medical intervention, usually in the form, in this case, of physical therapy, physical rehabilitation. And what social practice is kind of working in a similar mode. It is not an alternative to psychiatric or psychotherapeutic techniques. It's an adjunct that really takes care of these particular issues. And now we're going to talk about how this is related to the overall kind of history of psychotherapy and social work. And as I said before, our mode is community, and specifically an intentional community that is blended of staff, social practitioners, people using social practice, and members, the individuals that have experienced the illness in a blended environment. So even though Fountain House has been doing social practice in some form or another for the past 7 decades, the ideas of social practice do not originate or come only from Fountain House. It is part of a long tradition in both social work and mental health and psychology in general. It starts with let's say the 17th and 18th century understanding. Once mental illness was understood as an illness, there were really only 2 types of therapy that were promoted. One was called moral therapy, or sometimes called attitude therapy, and the other was called mechanical therapy. Mechanical therapy being physical or physiological interventions. These could be cold water baths, restraints, herbal infusions, bloodletting, that kind of thing. Moral or attitude therapy really looked at the social relationships of individuals and trying to create a socially supportive environment for people suffering with mental illness. By the end of the 19th century, you start to get the idea of milieu therapy, milieu being the French word for like environment. And milieu therapy really focused on the environmental aspects. And when they're talking the environment, they're really talking about the interpersonal social environment. They're saying, and you get psychoanalysis out of this, and you get kind of more traditional ideas of psychotherapy at this period of what is the relationship between me and the individual with the illness, and are there certain relationships that are inherently therapeutic, and can we improve on that? So milieu therapy starts to expand that definition to not just the therapist and the patient, but other people that interact with the patient, because most of this was done in hospitals. So people like H.A. Sullivan, famous psychoanalyst in America, had this idea of that not only is there needs to be therapeutic relationship between the individual and, say, the psychiatrist, but the nurses, the attendants, even the janitor, all these people have an impact, and that if they were all focused, or what we would say intentional, in their interactions with the patients at the hospital, they could affect greater therapy or greater recovery. Environmental therapy comes out of the post-World War II and really has to do with the integration of people traumatized from the war experiences, particularly in Europe, and reintegrating them or rehabilitating them so that they can enter civilian society. And environmental therapy expands from these beginnings with Meyerson and other people to start also to critique the environments that mental health recovery takes place in, namely the locked ward, the large hospital, the total institution. So environmental therapy said not only is the environment not conducive to therapeutic recovery, it actually inhibits recovery and makes people sick. Was one of the critiques of environmental therapy, that the environment can be used to make people sick or it could be used to make people healthy. Again, and it's out of this environmental therapy discussion and environment that John Beard, who is the founder of the kind of social practice model that we use at Fountain House and one of the first directors of Fountain House, he comes across this during his work in Michigan at a hospital called Eloise. And what he was interested in is what role positive or normalizing environments have on people who have had a crisis, a mental health crisis. He was working in the locked wards, and one of the things he started out with was taking them out of that environment and being with them in other environments, taking them to a restaurant and seeing, do they act like patients when they are in the restaurant? Do they act like customers in the restaurant, or do they act like something else? And taking them to baseball games and so on and so forth. He was also particularly interested in changing the environment in the hospital itself. He brought in a carpenter and asked the carpenter to put in a workbench with all the tools. You can imagine this, we're talking about the mid to late 40s. This was kind of shocking to give people who were locked away with, say, schizophrenia and all these other severe mental, giving them access to saws and hammers and nails. There was quite a fear what would happen. But what John Beard noticed happened is that for the most part, the behavior and even the kind of attitudinal aspects of folks were normalizing by just having a normalizing experience. John Beard gained some prominence with these experiments in Michigan, and then is invited to take over the directorship of Fountain House, a clubhouse that was started by ex-patients in 1948, and did have some staff here in Hell's Kitchen. John Beard was invited to become the director and did. He became disappointed, though, because it was a drop-in center. It was a place, it was a nice place, but a place people shot. They had a pool table, they played cards, they drank coffee, and he didn't see much recovery going on. And he didn't know what to do because they already had kind of a normalizing environment to a certain degree, but he didn't see much recovery going on. So one day, his secretary, Mary Smith, he heard some noise and went downstairs, and he saw Mary Smith working with a bunch of members of this clubhouse, Fountain House, making lunch and talking and having, and he thought, and he says, that if anybody had walked in, they would not have thought anything was going on. But he saw that there was a therapeutic moment happening in this very normalized experience. So then he spent his next 20-some years at Fountain House really focusing on the ideas of social practice and what are the elements of it and how to create a community and an environment that enhances that. And that is kind of what we are going to talk about for the next part of this webinar. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the recovery goals. So I said, yes, social practice is looking at things like social symptoms. It believes it has something to say about this intractable problem that has affected so many people in their quality of life, but also that society spent so much money and effort trying to work on. And we think social practice is part of that solution. And in particular, around these particular goals. And there are 5 goals that we'll be kind of going over, and this is a summary of that. And what we are interested in, what social practice takes as a given is that it is a recovery model, and taking the idea of recovery, which is not necessarily putting something in that wasn't there, but accessing something that's there that may be alienated or removed from the person in the society. So our big thing you will hear over and over again is that we are trying to connect to the healthy part of the person. That was John Beard's idea, that no matter how sick an individual was, that was only the tip of the iceberg. Underneath that was a great reserve of experience, life experience, skills, and healthy desires that needed to be channeled to overcome any challenges that the illness may provide. So let's look at them. So self-efficacy. This is the idea, comes from people like Bandura, comes from humanistic psychology. The idea that part of living a healthy life is having some belief in having some control over your own environment, that I have the power to control my own environment, to make positive changes, not only in my environment, but in my behavior in my life.
Yeah, I mean, I and people I know knew that they had no control over their lives. They felt untethered, and it was a helpless feeling, you know. And it's nothing. Nothing can grow from it. It's complete stagnation.
So the first thing social practice needs to try to do is create a community in which the individual will have various experiences in which self-efficacy comes from. So that means having decision-making, having an effect on the environment, seeing that effect, and having an effect on others. These are all key components of building self-efficacy. Self-efficacy can be built just the same way that it can be removed with mental health crisis. And I think social practice is a really excellent way, and we've seen it for the tens of thousands of people, how effective it can be. What you're going to see is some of these goals, and many of these goals are interlinked. They lock together. more in an ecology, but we're trying to pull apart them to make it more kind of understandable. So improved self-esteem and meaning creation is important and very difficult to do outside of a community and real life experiences. So take meaning creation. We believe, and most people, and there's plenty of research, that meaning is a key component on how satisfied somebody is with their life. We want to have meaning. It's not enough to keep people busy. People need to have something that's meaningful. And how do you do that? How do you create a community where the work I do, I can start to create meaning for myself? That it's not, what might be meaningful for Mark is different for me. And how do I create a community or an environment that both of us can find meaning? And then self-esteem comes from that being able to find meaning and going back to that self-efficacy. So self-esteem is just a confidence level of how I can find meaning and how I can achieve that. And so social practice needs to be able to take that into account and be very intentional about it. And it's complex.
Yeah, and the reason it's got to be a real environment is because you can only build self-esteem if you're doing things that make you know that you're doing well and you're getting great feedback and it's having a real effect. I mean, there are many programs that just do busy work. And, a human being is going to not respond well to that.
Right, and we have a phrase in social practice that's used a lot. You can't vacuum in a vacuum. What we mean about that is the difference between busy work and meaningful work. Let me give you an example. Let's say I have some kind of culinary therapy class, and we're cutting up food and we're learning how to cook or prepare food. It's different than, say, in a community or an environment that is dependent on the food that you make, and they feel that they can tell you whether it's good or not. And you're making the salad, say for lunch, and then Mark eats and says, "Yeah, that was good." That's meaningful. That's I don't have to create it. It is there. And hopefully success begets success, just as failure also creates a habit, an expectation of more failure, that we can improve self-esteem in this natural kind of setting. And the natural setting is important because it's complex, and each person is an individual. So we need these complex settings for it to work. Resiliency is a key part because we know enough about the illness, severe mental illness, that there isn't going to be, for most people, linear progress. There are going to be setbacks. There's going to be frustrations. There's going to potentially be more crises. The medication may stop working. You may stop using the medication. And everyday life requires us to be able to deal with the blows of things that don't work.
Yeah, before one has support in social practice therapy, life can derail you completely. And you have to start all over again every time you make progress and have a setback. It's completely discouraging and disheartening. Here you have a setback. Your life doesn't fall apart. Things are not sabotaged, and you have a chance to pick up again.
And you can see how that affects things like self-esteem, self-efficacy. I think the mistake many people make with the idea of resiliency, at least in the U.S., is that it is something that is completely individualistic. It's almost like self-sufficient is resiliency. And resiliency is really about how do I navigate to get the help I need when I need it.
Well, most people in normal development build a support system throughout their natural life, high school, college, family, and work colleagues, and you know, the negative symptoms, the social symptoms, are all about isolation and lack of participation in any kind of real life experiences.
Which we, as you can see, will reduce anybody's resiliency, because so much of our resiliency is our confidence in our ability to get help where we need it from our social networks, or at least how to navigate our community to find what we need in it. And if you don't feel that, and that has not been your experience, it will, negatively affect one's resiliency. Social and economic stability is a key component, often overlooked, I think, by mental health practitioners. It certainly isn't overlooked by social practice, but I think it often is. I think it's extremely difficult, and the research seems to suggest this, but it's extremely difficult to have a healthy state of mind when you have a precarious social or economic situation. If you ask people what would make them anxious, you ask them, would you be anxious or fearful or depressed if you lost your job, lost your house, lost your family? They would say yes, of course. That would be a normal response to that. And yet we tend to overlook the precariousness that so many, actually the vast majority of people that are suffering with severe mental illness have every day.
Every day. And the reality is their life is by default. And there's no plan, there's no choices, just whatever the world brings them. And usually it's involved with systems and mental health systems and state and city, federal, and it doesn't foster anything good.
Yeah, it doesn't. If you look at the other goals we were talking about, how can you have a good sense of self-efficacy if I am completely reliant on charity workers for my housing?
Exactly.
Right. How do I get resiliency when, I don't know if my government check is coming in today or tomorrow, and I know that maybe the bureaucracy is not going to be able to understand me because I may have some difficulty explaining what I need. Precariousness is something that doesn't go along with mental health. So social practice needs to create a community that helps with the stability, but also creates the stability in the community itself, that there's some social stability and there's some economic remediation going on simultaneously. And that could be through employment programs or other things like that. So many members or many individuals with severe mental illness need to have social skills, need recovery or development. It depends on where and when the mental illness first struck. If it first struck when you were young and lasted for a very long time, you may have missed out on some social skill development. If it happened later in life, it is a recovery of social skills you once maybe possessed. And now because of the crisis, the trauma of the crisis, and maybe some of the symptoms of the illness, and sometimes even some of the side effects of the medication, we need to recover those social skills. And that is, again, something that's often overlooked. But if we're talking about things like employment, education, even housing, those are related to one's ability to master social interactions. And how do you do that in a way that, especially for individuals that may be scared or anxious to be involved in social interaction? Do you run a skills class? You can, but in social practice, what we do is we try to create an environment where social interactions happen all the time in a naturalistic setting.
Well, in the course of a natural day here in the Clubhouse with the intentional environment that we've set up, these things are happening all the time without people even realizing it. And then as people, as the staff and the facilitators of health here notice the progress, maybe even before the person themselves notices it.
There's a great story where when this building that we're in now, in Hell's Kitchen, the Fountain House, was being built and designed, a screaming match between John Beard and the architect about the width of the stairwell. And the architect was trying to explain to John Beard that you needed to have a wider stairwell for fire codes and things like that. And also it would look nicer. Aesthetically, it would be nicer. And there's plenty of room. You wouldn't be losing. And he's like, no, I want it as narrow as possible. And he's like, well, people are going to have to kind of bump into each other and negotiate. And he's like, yes, that's a normal social interaction. That's the kind of intentionality social practice brings, is where can we get the most amount of social interaction that's natural, not like we're going to sit in a class and be like, talk to your neighbor. We want to create, because people are coming at all different levels, and it's that different levels that's also a crucial part of the recovery process. So social skill recovery and development is something that social practice is involved in on a everyday basis, but it's also hardwired into the actual program itself.
That's right. Engagement with other people, but like you say, engagement with the program, and it is an entity that you relate to.
So those are the recovery goals. That's what we meant by it does other things, but those are the main recovery goals. One could ask the question, well, why those 5? Why? Over the 70 years, and certainly from outside research, those are the goals that those are the indicators of recovery for many of the people who have passed through Fountain House and other model programs like social practice. This is what they need. This is what they say they need. And so that is why we have chosen those recovery goals to develop social practice around. And this goes back to other programs. There are other people doing social practice, and these are the kind of social symptoms that we are trying to work on.
Yeah, and it's just all indicates alienation from life.
So there are 5 elements. So, okay, that's great. These are the goals you're trying to, but how do you actually achieve it? We've heard you talk about community and social practice, but what are the actual elements? How is that different? What are you actually doing that helps individuals achieve that, knowing that they have all these challenges, right? So we're going to try to explain that in very quick kind of summary. So the fundamental piece is engagement. Obviously, a community approach can only work if we can engage people, if they participate, if they voluntarily participate. That's a key component. I think it's very difficult to do social practice when people are mandated to be there. You probably can, but you have to create other areas where they can opt out then, and because voluntary nature is a key component. So we need to engage people. Why it's a key component is for self-efficacy and self-esteem, but it's also key to the social practitioner because that's how they know whether what they're doing is working or not. Are people coming back? Are people engaged? And that is a great way for the social practitioner to know what they're doing is actually working. And engagement can take a variety of forms. Actually, we are going to be having a webinar series that looks at all these tools, but the classic engagement would be me asking you to help me with something. Can you help me paint this wall? And you do, and while we're painting this wall, we get talking, and we're engaged together, right? But it could be individuals engaged with the task itself, has genuine interest. A new person might come into a intentional environment and see people, I don't know, Xeroxing the newspaper for the day and may be interested in how that Xerox machine works, or see people video editing a webinar and be interested in that, and that the actual activity itself is engaging. It's not necessarily the social practitioner or the other individuals or members there, but the activity itself. The environment itself can be engaging.
And people who come in, besides connecting with something they see here, can bring their own talents. I think of somebody who started a drum circle.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so it needs to be flexible enough to allow that. But engagement is sharing common interests. Engagement could be working on, a food stamp application, right? But John Beard was very intelligent that he also understood, because of the illness, engagement is not something that many people say that are socially isolated, that have lack of self-esteem or efficacy. They do a lot. And they will maybe, in the beginning, need times to disengage. And there needs to be places inside the program itself in which disengagement is allowed and not judged, and then you can come back. He talks about having nooks and spaces where people can go and hide, is what he says, to disengage, and then be able to come back. Think about it. Very few programs are set up that way. If I go to a class or I'm watching a webinar, it's very hard for me to disengage and then come right back in. The expectation is, in most programs, when you disengage, you've left. And here you could still be part of the community, but disengaging, which is a key component on the path of recovery.
Also, disengagement, I'm sorry.
You lost your train.
The allowance of disengagement doesn't foster a sense of failure in the person, that I must leave because I'm overstimulated. It allows for that to be the natural flow of things. Everybody goes through coffee breaks. Everybody takes some time for themselves to meditate for 5 minutes here and there.
And so, but engagement is not an end to itself. Our job, social practice, is not about simply endlessly engaging people, and that will lead to recovery. Engagement is necessary and primary, but it's trying to lead to things like relationships. And relationships can be a relationship between a social practitioner and an individual. It could be between two members of that community. It could be also to the community itself. And it should be all of these things, because what we're trying to do is create relationships that allow for positive change. Positive change can be very scary and can be very difficult. And so change always involves risks. It always involves ambiguity and anxiety. And having relationships, not just things you're engaged in, but having relationships could make the difference whether you move up or move towards recovery and take those risks or not.
Also, a member has to feel that there's possibility here. They leave the comfort of their isolated lives. They travel. They spend the money. They walk into a building. And if they're withdrawn and isolated here, what's the purpose? Also, some people think saying hello is a relationship. You're now welcome. Well, there's a lot more to that.
The other thing that's different about how we see relationships in many other programs or in much of life, the relationship is defined ahead of time. So for many of our members, their relationships with mental health are always defined in a very similar way. Consumer, in which they are, and a provider. In that They can even be seeing the same provider for many years, and the relationship remains pretty much that. In social practice, relationships are much more fluid and dynamic and are changing to kind of represent, and not represent, but to be the same type of relationships that are outside of this particular therapeutic community. The difference between the relationships here and in a non-therapeutic community is that the intention is to provide for recovery and these other interlocking
things like social skills. So on a Friday, for example, a social practitioner can engage as someone they have a relationship with about the weekend.
Right.
And perhaps that person really was not going to have anything to do on the weekend, but through that conversation, through that relationship, that person actually winds up doing something.
And relationships change, and that's an important part. Community building is obviously if your main mode of getting this practice out in social practice is community, an intentional therapeutic community, community building is an important part. The key thing to remember about this is that the community is always in the process of building and rebuilding itself. It can't be static because the individuals have to have the power to see that the community can change, that they're changing the community, they're making the community, and so they can take some efficacy, some and also some esteem in when the community is doing well. It's because of them. They didn't just inherit a community. So the Fountain House of 70 years ago should and must be different than the Fountain House today. And the Fountain House next year or 2 years from now has to be different than today because the individuals need to be able to create that.
And because individuals move on.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody who comes here and gets a social practice and feels more confident to go out in the world,
mm-hmm.
Other people will come in with different interests and different skills, and the community will change, and that's interesting and exciting.
So data collection-based intervention is where social practice has a real advantage. And in some ways, this therapeutic intentional community or working community that members are participating, that's a blended community where they're participating with social practitioners in the exact same activities, everybody's doing the same stuff, is a huge advantage for creating interventions for areas that people are struggling. Because you have so much data. You have so much data that is right there. So I'm working with Mark, for example, and we're working on vacuuming the living room because there's going to be a meeting later in that day. He and I are vacuuming, and I notice he's missing big parts of the carpet, and he thinks it's done. And sometimes maybe he's even vacuuming with it being unplugged, and it's not even turned on because the plug is pulled out of the wall. I don't need to sit and talk to Mark about what struggles you might have. And say Mark's goal has been to go to work. He's like, I've had a lot of jobs, but they've never worked out. I don't know why, but they don't work out. I struggle with jobs. Here now, I've collected data without having to ask anything. And more importantly, I can make it absolutely transparent. It's not my idea versus his. It can be like, Mark, it seems like we need to work on your observational ability, observing around you. And the community allows us lots of opportunity to do that. And so a social practitioner, the staff that's in this blended community, is receiving information all the time. Whereas many other ways to receive information require a high level of articulation, mm-hmm. require a level of self-reflection and memory. Remembering. And then it requires a kind of theorizing on the part of the helper, the supporter. This way, in social practice, we have a real advantage that it's right there in front of both of our sets of eyes, and we have all these tools we can use to remediate it.
Yeah, our rehabilitation community is doing all this naturally.
And that's a key part of it.
It's just getting to know people. Data collection is a big term, and just think about it in a life outside of people with mental illness. You just get to know people.
Right. Let's say, for example, both you and I periodically lose our temper and yell at people in the community. The assumption that we're doing it for the same reason, there's no reason to believe that. The behavior is the same, but why we're doing it and what triggers it and what causes it will be known to the community. They'll see that this is what causes it. Every time he's stressed out, he does this, or maybe other things, and it could be very different. And the social practitioner gets that information and can allow for very individualized work.
And individualized realize this too. They're not being treated in a generic way like everybody else.
Which is very exciting for anybody doing kind of mental health work. But social practice can't be a bubble. Again, all that stuff we've talked about still in the end is a means to an end. And the end being recovery. And for most people, their goal is to have their self-efficacy, have their social relationships, have their job, have their economic and social stability outside this intentional community. So for that goal to be achieved, we need the use of transitional environments. This kind of reminds me of the World War II when environmental therapy was coming, this kind of transition between war and civilian life. We use transitional environments. And transitional environments are environments that are communities, but the goal is not therapeutic. We at Fountain House particularly use employment as our main transitional environment. So if in a transitional employment placement is a person will go to work at a job, let's say a mail clerk for Dow Jones, for about 6 months. And the idea, many people see this as vocational, and it might help somebody get a job, or pre-vocational, but it's really therapeutic. It doesn't matter if that individual is interested in going to work. They may even be a retired person, but it is a chance to see a person, work with a person in an environment, do social practice with the person in a real environment that the goal is not therapy, which in a therapeutic or recovery goal, the goal is to deliver the mail. That's the goal. And they need to work with other people. They need to be treated the same. Their job duties can't be reduced. They get paid the same. They get paid by the company because it's a transitional environment. It doesn't matter whether Mark is interested in being a mail clerk or not. That's not the point of it. It is to get used to communities and do social practice in communities with other goals.
Right, and this is usually a pivotal part of somebody's recovery. It's after they've built relationships, formed a little bit of self-efficacy, and they're taking a real leap at that point because they're moving into what they would term the real world, which I'm not ready for. No, that's not for me. It's never been for me. I'm different. And if an observer looks at somebody, a job, or let's say a mailroom, they won't be able to tell the difference between all the other employees and the person who's got this job in a transitional way. And makes a person feel great. I personally remember my first TE, and what I liked about it was dressing and going and being part of the masses. And like, I am part of the Manhattan workforce.
Yeah, it's powerful. And it is usually the kind of reinforcement that you're well on your way to recovery.
Also, the trauma that's occurred to bring you to this place of lack of confidence. I work with a young guy, and he wanted a job, and we were looking at the available jobs, and he didn't want to work in an office. He wanted to work like as a stock or something alone. And I said, all right, well, if that's your preference, that's fine. But because I knew him and I got a feeling that there might be something more to the story, and it turned out that it was just complete lack of confidence. He was distant from any kind of real world experience, and now the idea of going into a professional setting with people who have gotten up every day of their lives to do something and now arrived here is completely intimidating. So the way I was able to even have him consider it was explain the supportive nature of our transitional program.
Mm-hmm. In those elements we went over very quick. Obviously, how do you provide the supportive element in a transitional environment? What are the tools you can use for engaging people who are hard to engage? Or how do you build relationships with people that have lack of social skills or anxiety? We will eventually go into all those in later webinars, but we wanted to give you a summary of what social practice is and really the kind of promise of, where social practice can go, that it's really a professional form of social work that is very highly focused on these kinds of social symptoms, and that it is, something that's been around for a while. It's not a new idea. It's well nested in the ideas of social work and psychology and human behavior. It's an evidence-based model, and one that we think is very exciting.
And it's the thing that people feel is the most suffering. They don't come in saying about symptoms of their illness. It's saying, look at what happens to my life. It's a very high misery index.
Yeah, the loneliness, the lack of employment, these are the things that cause real world suffering. And we believe social practice is definitely a tool that can be used with other programs and adjuncts to really reduce that suffering. We're going to have future webinars where we're going to go into those individual elements of social practice. We're also going to talk about applications of social practice outside of the Fountain House model. Can you do social practice in a prison? Can you do social practice maybe in a mobile homeless outreach? We're going to hear from other social practitioners and other researchers and theorists are going to be talking about what are the traits of a successful social practitioner and so on. So stay tuned for all of that. And now we could take, we have a little bit of time, and we could take a few questions if anybody has any.
Thank you both very much. We do have a few questions. The first is, how are social practitioners trained?
Well, I think we say that this is a form of training, and the webinars that will follow is a form of training.
Right. We Fountain House has been interested in this for a while. We have a Center for Leadership and Education where people are putting together this webinar, and they do trainings all year long from all over the place with people that are interested in learning about this. About 6 years ago, we published a book that has some of that. In our own community, we have trainings where members and staff train other members and staff. And that's the other thing. Members and individuals in these therapeutic communities benefit by understanding the model, and a lot of the therapeutic value comes not from the social practitioner, but from the other individuals, the peers in the group. And that's a healthy social practice. So other members understanding the stuff that we're training today. So this is just a summary of what would be a larger training.
And just Fountain House is the model of what they call Clubhouse, and through the organization that is sponsoring us today, the Learning Center, they have opened 200,
Over 300, yeah.
around the world, and they come here for training.
There are other training bases too. There's like 5 or 6 training bases around the world. So
also, I think it's evidence-based, isn't that like 30 years of evidence?
Thank you. Just as a reminder to our attendees, if you do have a question, you could submit your question in the bottom right-hand panel of the Q&A screen. The next question is community a prerequisite for social practice?
yes, community is the most, it would be like saying is conversation a prerequisite for most psychotherapy? And the answer is yes. There has to be some communication. The reason is community is important because individuals have different challenges, different sets of goals, and there has to be in different histories. And what we're doing is so subtle that there has to be enough different experiences, and it has to be naturalistic. It can't be classes, and it can't be things like that. It needs this organic element of a living, changing community to really be able to do social practice. Now, luckily, community comes in many sizes, many different descriptions, and so I think there's a lot of ability to create various styles of community that might look very different. But community is our therapy. That is the kind of mode in which
the community is a necessary element for people to even want to come here. And part of their lives is a dearth of community, or a dearth of healthy community. And it's what gets one away from their symptoms, even though we're talking about negative and social symptoms, just to talk about positive symptoms for a second. Being here, being engaged with other people can take you out of yourself.
Thank you. The next question is, given that individuals with SMI die 10 to 20 years earlier than the general population, how does social practice address the physical health concerns of individuals?
Well, I think it does that quite a bit. I mean, there was the World Health Organization just last month put out the guidelines of the social determinants for health that had to deal with folks with severe mental illness. Because we all know, this is now 25 years of research, that robust social networks allow for positive health change. So we know that individuals that have social networks and have resiliency are going to be healthier. But what we also know is the reverse is true. If you strip people of their social network, if people go into isolation, if people become hopeless and feel precarious and all of these things, that leads often to negative health behavioral changes. Maybe smoking, maybe self-medicating, maybe addiction, maybe sedentary, not going out. So it's a double-edged sword, but so I think social practice what we're going to see, we're in the midst of some research right now. We don't have the data yet, but we're in the midst of some research on that particular question of, say, the members of the Fountain House community, are they healthier than the others as far as comorbidity? My guess is the answer is going to be yes, it will follow the trend of all the other research. I don't expect us to be different.
I don't expect it to be different, and the culture at large is accepting the mind-body connection and a little Eastern medicine, and so I think it's not going to be too long in the future that
If the promise of social practice is to reach those 5 recovery goals, those have to have a profound effect on the health choices people make and on their feeling of wellness and how they have access to health resources.
and the
in their
motivation to
neighborhood
want to
and
use it because
Yeah.
you now have a life with a little bit.
I'd be shocked if it doesn't have a very profound effect.
Thank you. The next question is, how can we keep social practitioners honest and authentic in their approach?
Honest and authentic in their approach.
Well, authenticity is a key to the part. If you take the webinar on the traits of a social practitioner, being authentic is a key element. How to keep them? I think having a robust community will necessitate that, I guess. Mark, what do you think?
I think for a member here to relate to a social practitioner, they got to cut through the bull, and they sense it.
Good question, though.
Thank you. The next is, how does a social practitioner differ from a generalist?
So people that were working in therapeutic communities, intentional communities around severe mental illness, often the kind of line staff or the main staff that worked with the individual were called generalists. And that was a term to differentiate against specialization, that they're part of the community, they're working in the community with the members, and that there wasn't a specific kind of specialty, like a housing specialist or a vocational specialist. That was where the idea of it's problematic. So social practitioner is a specialist in a sense of doing social practice. So we prefer now the term social practitioner as a term because it is one that does social practice. So in the end, I think we will see social practitioner just simply edge out and push out the term generalist in these therapeutic communities.
I feel that the term generalist refers more to a task as opposed to the person, and that's why I think social practitioner. However, the social practitioner also has to have a variety of knowledge, so that, as you said before, they know about housing. They don't send somebody to somebody else.
Well, they work with the community. You don't leave the community to get social practice. And whether that social practice is engaging you with benefits, you should be able to get that in that community. Doesn't mean you get everything in that community. If it's not related to social practice, then you may or may not get that in that community. But all social practice needs to be done. And all social practitioners are expected to be able to do all the different aspects, those 5 different elements we talked about to reach recovery.
And we also have good relationships outside of Fountain House, so if somebody needs help with certain things, we're pretty good at referring them.
Thank you. The next is there a way to utilize social practice outside of a professional setting?
Well, like I said, data collection is just getting to know people. So on a friendship level, the more you get to know them, and if you want to show consideration for them, you respect what you learn about them.
I would think possibly faith-based communities might use elements of social practice with their congregations to try to. It's a good question. I'm sure the elements of social practice are used by lay people for inside their community, but I don't have any specific examples.
Okay, thank you. That is all the questions that we have for today. Thank you everyone for coming to the webinar. Please be on the lookout for announcements regarding our future webinars. Everyone have a great day.